Alright, so today we're going to go over 5.5 part 2. Monday, we did part 1 and we added our functions, subtracted, and multiplied. Today we're just going to do division and then putting them into our calculator to solve. So you're going to need your calculator today for the second half of these notes. So we're just looking at division today. It's the same thing we were doing before, but now we just divide our two functions, and then the one difference is we always have to check our denominator to make sure it's not equal to 0. Because if we get 0 in the denominator of a fraction, our fraction's undefined. So one thing that we have to include in our domain is when the denominator does not equal 0. So we would solve for when it equals 0. So how would we solve? X plus 2 is equal to 0. What would we need to do? How do we solve for x? Subtract 2. So we would just solve as if we would equal to 0. So we get x does not equal negative 2. So we always have to include whatever this is into our domain as well, because we can't have negative 2 be a value for x. So we just got to keep that in mind when dividing our fractions. So dividing two functions, we need to find f over g of x. So we just take our function, f, which is 6x, and put it over x to the power of 3/4. Now we need to simplify. We have an x on top and x on the bottom. We're dividing. How can we combine these x's together? We're dividing. What do? What's our exponent for the x on top? 1. Subtract. So that 6 just stays out front, and then we have x to the power of 1 minus 3/4. We need a common denominator in order to subtract, so we're going to make this 4/4. And then we just subtract. So we have 6 times x to the power of 1/4. Now we need to state the domain. So we're going to start with our number line. What is the domain of f of x? Anything we can't plug into 6x? No. So what would our domain be? All real numbers. So we have all of the numbers on our number line. And what about x to the power of 3/4? What can we not plug in here? Negative numbers, because we have an even index. Because that 4 is on the bottom, can't plug in negative numbers. So it has to be from 0 to infinity. And then before we see what's in common, we got to check our denominator of our fraction. So we go back here and we see when is x to the power of 3/4 not equal to 0. And we solve for x. So how do we get rid of that 3/4 in our exponent? Raise it to the power of 4/3. So we do the same thing to 0. So this cancels, so we get x does not equal, what's 0 to the power of 4/3? 0. So x cannot equal 0. So we would put an open circle here to show that we can't have 0. So now we need to see what is in common between the pink line and the blue line. In interval notation, how would we write our domain? So like how we were doing before. What's the smallest value we can have? We can have anything greater than 0. So like we could have 0.5 because that's bigger than 0, but it's still smaller than 1. So we would put a parentheses here instead of a bracket, because remember, a bracket means that it is included, Parentheses means that it's not included. So we would put from 0 to what? Infinity. All right, last thing we need to do is evaluate when x is equal to 16. So we're going to plug it in. So we have f over g of 16. We're going to plug it into our simplified version here because it just makes it a lot easier. So we have 6 times 16 to the power of 1/4. And just remember that that 1/4 is only an exponent on the x, so it's only affecting the 16. We cannot multiply 6 and 16 together before we get rid of that 1/4. So what can we do next? Awesome. Our index is 4, so we take the 4th root of 16. So what are our factors of 16? 4 and 4. So we have 2, 2, 2, and 2. Circle groups of 4. So we have 6 times 2. So what's our answer? 12. So we have our new function, our domain, and when we evaluate when x is 16. All right, in our next example, we have to find f times g of x and f divided by g of x. I'm going to do the division one first just because that's what we're focusing on today, but I'll do the multiplication one second. So we have to find f over g of x. So we put our function f of x on top and our g of x on the bottom. Now we have to simplify. So if we're dividing, how do we combine these together? Subtract. So we have 3 times x to the power of 1 minus 1 over 5. We change our 1 to 5 over 5. So this becomes 3 times x. What's our exponent on x? 4/5. So this is our new function. Now let's find our domain. What's our domain of f of x? Anything we can't plug in there? Nope. So we have all real numbers for f of x. What about g of x? What's our domain there? Same thing, all real numbers. Perfect. Because that index is odd, we can have negative numbers there. So we have all real numbers. And then we just have to check when our denominator is equal to 0. We cannot have 0 in our denominator. So how do we solve for x here? Raise each side to the 5th power. So this is x is equal to, does not equal to, what's 0 to the 5th power? 0. So x cannot equal 0. So we have a big hole here at 0. So we would write this in interval notation as from negative infinity to 0 with our parentheses because that's not including 0. And then we have to include the positive numbers too, so then we would have 0 to infinity. I would accept all real numbers except 0. So as we go along, you'll have to know how to write this, but for now, if you want to leave it just as all real numbers except 0, you can write it like that. It's a little bit easier, in my opinion. But they mean the same thing. Alright, last thing we have to do is evaluate. So we're plugging in 32 into what? Three times x to the 4/5, this one, the simplified form. So we have 3 times 32 to the 4/5 power. How do we evaluate 32 to the 4/5 power? What's our index? 5. So we're taking the 5th root of 32 to the 4th power times 3. What are our factors of 32? 8 and 4. Our factors of 8 are 2, 2, and 2. Factors of 4 are 2 and 2. Circle groups of 5. So we take out a 2. So we have 2 to the 4th power times 3. What's 2 to the 4th power? 16. And 16 times 3? 48. Found our new function, found our domain, and evaluated. Now we have to do the same thing for f times g of x. So that was just the dividing one. Now we can move on to multiplication. So f times g of x. We just multiply them together, so we have 3x times x to the power of 1/5. How can we combine these? If we're multiplying, what do? Add the exponent. So we have 3 times x to the power of 1 plus 1/5. What do we change the 1 to in order to add? 5/5. So what do we get for our new exponent? 6/5. So 3 times x to the power of 6/5. Now let's find our domain. So what did we say our domain of f is? All real numbers. What about our domain of g? All real numbers. Because that index is odd, we can have negatives. So we have all real numbers and all real numbers. Don't have to check anything else. We just need to see what's in common. So in common between our blue line and our orange line is all real numbers. So our domain is all real numbers. Last thing we need to do is plug it in. So we're plugging in 32 again. So we have 3 times 32 to the power 6/5. So it's a little bit different than what we just did before because that exponent's different. So our index is 5. What did we say the 5th root of 32 was? 2. Now we have 2 to the 6th power. So what's 2 to the 6th power? 64. And 64 times 3? 192. Perfect. So we found our function, our domain, and we evaluated. Any questions here?
Miss Carver?
Yes.
Julia says she's in the...
Our next example. So here we need to use a calculator. You're going to want to use a calculator. It says use a graphing calculator, but you don't need a graphing calculator. You can just use a normal calculator to evaluate. So we need to find f plus g of x, f minus g of x, f times g of x, and f over g of x. So let's do one at a time. We have f plus g of x. So we just add our two functions together. Square root of x plus the square root of 9 minus x squared. We're evaluating these when x is 2. So we're just going to plug in 2 into all of our x's. So we have the square root of 2 plus the square root of 9 minus 2 squared. You could just put this in your calculator, but if you want to simplify a little bit more, it would probably be easier just to simplify under the square root first. So what's 2 squared? 4. And 9 minus 4 is 5. So we have the square root of 2 plus the square root of 5. What do we get when you put it in the calculator? Awesome. 3.65. And it says to round to 2 decimal places. So we have 2 decimal places. Perfect. Next, we need to find f minus g of 2. So we just subtract our two functions and plug in 2. So we have the square root of 2 minus the square root of 9 minus 2 squared. So this is the square root of 2 minus the square root of 5. What do we get? Negative 0.82. Awesome. Now we need to multiply. So f times g of 2. So the square root of 2 times the square root of 9 minus 2 squared. So the square root of 2 times the square root of 5. What do we get? 3.16. And then lastly, f over g of 2. So we have the square root of 2 times the square root of 9 minus 2 squared. So the square root of 2 times square root of 5. Oh no, divided by. My bad. Square root of 2, so f of x over the square root of 9 minus 2 squared. So this would be the square root of 2 over the square root of 5. What do we get? 0.63. Awesome. So we have 4 answers here.